Okay, this video is looking at conservation biology and restoration ecology. We'll look at what is biodiversity, why we might value it, the two different approaches, a species approach and an ecosystem approach, and then some examples of conservation and restoration efforts. So what is biodiversity? Well, typically we might focus on species, individual species, like how many different types of coral are there in this coral reef, or how many different species of fish are there on the coral reef. That's known as species diversity. We're also interested in ecosystem diversity and genetic diversity by having a lot of different types of ecosystems, like coral reefs and seagrass beds and mangroves and coastal savannas. You can then protect more species as a result, more overall diversity. Likewise, genetic diversity might give us some insight as to how species can adapt and change. If they're more variable at a genetic level, then species can adapt to climate change or ocean acidification or something like that. So really, biologists are interested in all of these. But typically we focus on species richness as the easiest to convey. There are 23 species of birds that come to this particular area, or 50 species of fish found in Honduras, or something like that. You know, that's going to tell us how diverse a system is. Now, how would you figure out for the whole Earth how many species there are on the whole Earth? Well, Terry Irwin did this for a species of tree in the Panamanian rainforest, sampled 19 individuals of this species up in the canopy by spraying this insecticide fog. If you're interested in kind of a live action visualizations of this, watch the first 10 minutes of the movie Arachnophobia, and they do this at the start to collect spiders. So it's kind of the thing that launches the movie. But basically he did this and collected 1,200 species of beetle in the canopy of just this one species of tree. He's a beetle expert, that's his area of focus, but that's absolutely astonishing biodiversity. 160 of those were only found in this particular tree, not in any of the other ones that he looked at. And so that represents kind of the unique biodiversity just found in the canopy, just for beetles, just on this one tropical tree. Now, to extrapolate this up, you would do some fuzzy math. And so basically he said, well, if beetles are 40% of all of the arthropod biodiversity, so spiders and ants and other insects would account for more, and the canopy is twice as diverse as the rest of the tree, you have to account for the diversity that is specialized on the rest of the tree, you would have 600 species specialized on this tree species found nowhere else on the planet. Again, that's an estimate, but it's at least a first crack at what's the biodiversity of the planet. Times these 600 species times 50,000 species of trees found in the tropical rainforests of the world gives you a grand total of 30 million species. Again, this was a first estimate, but this kind of shocked biologists and kind of questioned our assumptions, because at that point we had known and described about 1 million species worldwide, and this would suggest that there's vast quantities of biodiversity that we don't know. Subsequent investigations have found that the number's closer to 3 to 10 million species, but that still indicates that now that we know about 1.5 million species, we still only know at most half of the biodiversity that's found on our planet. So why do we care? So if you want to, you can pause the video at this point and write down some reasons why you might care about biodiversity. Think of different types of reasons why you might potentially care, and then restart the video. So here are some reasons that I thought of. First of all, we might care about human life and might want to preserve ecosystem functions to sustain human life. The tropical rainforest produces a lot of oxygen that we might like to breathe, so we might want it for that reason. There are medicines available. Roughly 40% of the medicines on the market ultimately are derived from some sort of plant origin. So if there's unknown biodiversity, there might be medicines that we don't know about that and products and chemicals, and this might help us to then save human life. There might be benefits to agriculture, benefits to industry, or we might just appreciate the beauty of nature and like to go vacation there. So these would be aesthetic reasons. Other types of reasons might be that the species has a role in the ecosystem. It's going to protect the function of the system for other species, not just for humans. There might be the evolutionary potential. Each species is undergoing natural selection, and it's going to change and adapt as conditions change. And so by having more species, we have more potential to adapt to evolutionary changes. We also might say that there's ethical reasons why we want to protect species, that each species has a value just because it exists, not because we can put a dollar value on a given species. And so that might be a reason. All in all, these correspond to utilitarian values and intrinsic values. The values on the left-hand side are human-focused. They're useful to humanity, so we say they're utilitarian, or humans can use them. It has value just because we can use it, and if we can't use it, then it doesn't have value. Versus intrinsic values state that a species has value just simply because it exists. It has value in and of itself, and its role, whether it helps humans or not. These correspond to anthropocentric and biocentric worldviews. Anthropocentric worldviews would be human-centered, focused more on utilitarian values, versus biocentric would have more focus on intrinsic values. Now, for conservation biology and restoration ecology, there are basically two fundamental approaches. One is focus on species, such as the Endangered Species Act, and the other would be focus on whole ecosystems, such as nature preserves. Each of these can protect biodiversity, but the goal is focused on different things. So for the species approach, you want to protect individual species that are at risk from premature extinction. So you have to identify them, protect them and their critical habitats, using the laws of a given country or state, manage their habitat, propagate them in captivity, and if possible, then reintroduce them back into the natural habitat. So it's a species by species approach. If it's at risk, then we step in and we protect it. Versus the ecosystem approach says, here's a unique ecosystem worthy of saving. We're going to protect populations of species in their natural habitats and preserve sufficient areas in different types of biomes and in different types of aquatic ecosystems. This can be done through private purchase. It can be done through government action, government purchase. And then once you have these lands, you want to manage them in order to reduce populations of non-native species, aim to protect the critical functions of native species. So the system is managed for the native species. And if there's part of the system that's degraded, you want to restore the system to a healthy ecosystem. So for the species approach, a species by species approach, the Endangered Species Act is a good example of this. This provides protection for two levels of species, endangered and threatened. Endangered is worse. It means it's in danger of going extinct, versus threatened means it's in danger of becoming endangered. Okay, in danger of becoming endangered. So threatened is kind of like a safety net. We're going to step in if it's starting to go bad, but it's not at critical risk of going extinct yet. It applies to whole species as well as subspecies. So if you had a species on the West Coast and the East Coast, if the East Coast population is doing fine, but the West Coast population is threatened by habitat development, then the federal government or the state government would step in and protect that particular subspecies found on the West Coast in all of the range or part of the range. When the bald eagle went on the endangered species list, there were plenty of bald eagles in Alaska. But in the lower 48 states, we were down to maybe 400 individual pairs. So not a whole lot if that's divided among 48 states. So the federal government stepped in and said, we're going to protect the bald eagle in that part of the range, the lower 48 states. And of those 48, half of those eagles were in the state of Florida. All the rest were spread over the other 47. So the federal government can do that and designate it on the federal list. Each individual state also can have an individual state list. So if the federal government is not doing enough to protect a species in an area, the state can step in and say, in our territory, this is protected. And there's critical habitat, protection of critical habitat, because an organism can't exist without its habitat. So both receive protection. Internationally, there's something called the CITES list, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So you can't harvest sea turtles from another country and then import the shells, for example, or jewelry made out of the green sea turtle that's depicted here. The species is protected, it can't be traded across international lines, and then its habitat, such as the seagrass bed, is protected. In Virginia, these are some species that are considered to be on the endangered or threatened list, or at least in the recent past had been included. S refers to state, F refers to federal, and T refers to threatened, E refers to endangered. So the barking tree frog is considered to be Virginia state threatened. Shenandoah salamander has both federal and state protection as endangered. Canebrake rattlesnake, the federal government hasn't declared it as endangered, but the state has. The peregrine falcon, at least a few years ago, was considered on the state threatened list. It has done a great job of recovering. Delmarva Peninsula fox squirrel. This is not your average gray squirrel. This is found only on the Delmarva Peninsula, and it's considered both federally endangered and state endangered. And these protections also extend to invertebrates, such as the purple bean clam, federally endangered and state endangered. So one approach to this is then captive breeding and reintroduction. Worldwide, raptors have been affected by a variety of things, including DDT, pesticide, people shooting them, people shooting other prey with lead shot, and then the lead accidentally gets ingested as they feed on the carrion. So as a result, many raptors, being at the top of the food chain, are threatened or endangered, including the Belize harpy eagle shown here. This is being captively bred in the Belize Zoo. With a lot of raptors, you can actually accelerate their survival and reproduction and reintroduction into the wild by doing captive breeding, because they'll lay an egg, but they could potentially develop another egg. So if you then remove that particular egg, the parents will both lay another, the female will lay another, and the male, it's fertilized by the male, and then they'll raise the other one, and then the spare egg that you have removed then can be hand reared by a puppet that looks like the parent, and then you could potentially reintroduce it to the wild because it hasn't imprinted on humans. So that's one technique for captive breeding and reintroduction. One of the fish examples would be the Devil's Hole pupfish. This is a very, very small pond located near the Nevada-California border. Technically, it's in Death Valley National Park, but it's a little annex of that located in Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. And this pool is the only place where this fish is found. A 2-inch long fish found there and nowhere else. This is about like 2 meters by maybe 10 meters, and that's the only place that this is found. Now, it does go 250 feet deep, but the front third of the picture, maybe from like the second funnel at the bottom, that is the area that is shallow enough for them to breed on. They come up into the shallows, they lay their eggs on the shallows, and then there's enough sunlight to support the algae that grows on the surface, and then they can feed on the algae and any invertebrates that live there. So this population has fluctuated between 50 individuals and about 800 individuals. It's usually about 250 or 300. And that's the only place it's found on the planet. You go to pools that are 3 miles away, And there's another pupfish species. It used to be interconnected, but with the drying of this area following the Ice Age, they've evolved into separate species that can't interbreed with each other and look completely different from each other. So they're isolated, and they're each receives a level of protection that's appropriate to its abundance. So this area is surrounded by fencing. You can see that on kind of the lower left of the picture of the pool, and it's covered on the top by razor wire. There are cameras, so if you decide, hey, I want to go swim with a pupfish, then alarms are going to go off at park headquarters, and you're going to be arrested very quickly. So it's protected. Scientists will study it every year, and they actually have kind of a backup population back at the park headquarters where they've taken a few and are doing captive breeding just in case the worst happened. The California condor is also considered endangered. They were down to 7 individuals in the wild because of habitat degradation, poaching, lead shot, as I mentioned, and their wings are big enough that they can touch 2 power lines at the same time, electrocuting the bird. As a result of the captive breeding program, their numbers are back in the several hundreds, and over 100 have been introduced in the United States in the wild. The north rim of the Grand Canyon, just south of the Central Valley, up in the mountains of California, and then in Baja California, there's another population. So overall, this is a breeding success. Even bugs, though, could potentially be protected under the Endangered Species Act. This is a 2-inch long bug called the American burying beetle, and it's on the endangered species list. It buries small mammal and bird carrion. The male and the female will dig underneath like a dead bird or a dead squirrel, lay their egg on it, bury it up, and then the larvae help to decompose these carcasses and eat the flesh off of that. So it's really disgusting, but it's in danger of protection. It was formerly much more abundant, relied on the heath hen and maybe the passenger pigeon, and now it's restricted to spots in Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Rhode Island. And so this raises the ethical question, or the political question too: should a bug receive Endangered Species Act protection? Should your tax dollars be used to save a bug? I would say yes, but different people are going to answer that in different ways. Now, looking at their range, scientists then investigated to see where it was, and they actually found it occurred in a wider range than they originally thought. So sometimes the funds used to study an endangered species and protect it are also to try to identify where else does it exist. And so they actually found other populations in South Dakota, Missouri, Arkansas, etc. They reintroduced it to Ohio in the Hocking Hills area. So this is an attempt to try to not put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, and have different burying beetles in different parts of the country. The other approach to species conservation is the ecosystem approach, and this protects whole ecosystems. A good example is the national park system in the United States. A lot of times ecosystems are protected by Yellowstone National Park and Grand Tetons National Park. These form some wilderness core areas. There are also areas where people can exist. So using the biosphere reserve concept, as you see in the picture to the right, there are areas that are core that are just for the wildlife and just for the endangered ecosystems and the species that inhabit them, but there are also areas around them where people can be involved to a more or less extent, such as a research station, a tourism and education center, maybe even human settlements. If a grizzly bear is protected as part of the ecosystem of Yellowstone National Park, the grizzly bear doesn't know when it gets to the edge of the habitat. And so we have to consider, how are we going to protect them if they go into Montana and kill some cattle, or into Idaho and steal a sheep, or eat a sheep? And or extend out into Wyoming and come into a human settlement. So we have to have kind of these buffer areas where we consider what are the potential ways that we can protect them and really kind of expand the core of this. It basically takes the ecosystem, and if we're doing things to the habitat outside of the core that make it suitable to wildlife, we've effectively expanded the size of our refuge. In Western Virginia, such as you see in the left-hand side of this column, there are several nature conservancy preserves, which are denoted by the little leaves. These are cases where the Nature Conservancy, a private NGO, non-governmental organization that's in the business of buying habitat and identifying unique habitat that is in need of conservation. And it's usually based on a rare plant assemblage that you find there. So bogs and fens and swamps and things like that could be protected, and then it protects all the plants that are in there, like endangered pitcher plants or unique pitcher plants and sundews and things like that. On the right-hand side, these are the reserves in the eastern shore of Virginia. So this includes Nature Conservancy reserves in dark green, Virginia state protected areas in purple and in medium green, and then federally protected national wildlife refuges seen up at the top in brown or orange. So this basically sets aside these whole areas. So by having this network of preserves, this ensures that the coastline of the eastern shore of Virginia is going to remain protected and not urbanized like Virginia Beach is. There's some parts near Chincoteague that have some development, but the actual coastline can't be developed to that same extent. In Costa Rica, there are different areas of national park land that are protected, and this constitutes about 25% of the area of Costa Rica. So it's a substantial amount of their land that is basically set aside primarily for the species that live there. And they've also considered this buffer zone around there where suitable land uses could potentially allow species to hop from one protected habitat to another. I had the pleasure of being able to visit La Selva Biological Station a couple of times. This is located in the area that's circled on the left map, and the circled area is the whole thing that's shown on the right-hand side, which includes La Selva, which even though it's at the top of the map, that's low elevation, and then as you go down through the gray protected areas up into Braulio Carrillo National Park, you can see from those two volcanoes that are highlighted on there that that's the higher elevation at the bottom of the map on the right. So this is a mountain range that kind of cuts across the center of Costa Rica. So coming from north to south, you go uphill. So what this did well is it conserved these areas, all the ones that are considered here, connected to each other, interconnected, that allow species to migrate from low elevation to high elevation. Certain birds in this area that inhabit the cloud forest will basically move from lower elevation at certain times of year, the quetzal, for example, up to higher elevations at other times of the year. And so they have to have this contiguous habitat that goes up and down the mountain in order to be able to be protected and have suitable habitat for their needs. This brings us to the concept of metapopulations. Metapopulations are where ecologists consider different sets of a population. So the whole population could potentially interbreed with each other. It's in the same type of habitat, but the habitat's isolated from each other, these little occupied patches or unoccupied patches. So we might consider how do species move from one to the other in order to see this as a whole big metapopulation, a whole big population comprised of several metapopulations. We might think of this as a source and a sink model. Maybe some of them are high quality, like these source ones indicated as source. This should increase the population of the carrying capacity, and then further reproduction they have nowhere to go, or they can't do anything in that habitat, so they might disperse to a low quality habitat, be able to survive there, be able to reproduce, but ultimately there might be more mortality in those areas. It might be lower quality habitat. So you have to think, how are these interconnected with each other? And then with the landscape model, how do organisms move through the landscape to get from one habitat patch to another? This sort of thing relates to a concept called island biogeography theory, and this basically poses that individual islands of habitat, whether it's a literal island in the sea or it's a patch of habitat in a sea of inhospitable habitat, is a result, the number of species found there is a product of or a function of the extinction rate and the immigration rate. So the immigration rate is bringing in new species to that habitat, dispersing from another area and then establishing themselves in that isolated place. And you can see that if you start with a low number of species, so on the left-hand side of this diagram, on the x-axis, you would have high immigration initially, and this is immigration of new species into that particular habitat. As that number then increases, you slide from the left to the right, and the immigration rate is going to go down because the odds of a species making it there, a species might colonize that area, but it already was previously colonized by the same species. In contrast, the extinction curve goes up. The more species you have on an island, the higher the extinction rate because there's more competition. And so the immigration and extinction rate should balance out at this equilibrium number denoted by the triangle here. So what factors might impact both immigration and extinction? Island size certainly could. We'll get an example of that. And how far it is from the shore. If it's far from the shore, it might be hard to immigrate into that area. There might be other factors that could, the amount of different habitats found on that particular island, et cetera, et cetera. So this depicts this graphically, the distance effect. If you had a near island and a far island, you might expect more species on the near island because the migration rate is higher. The species don't have to disperse as far to get there. A far island would have fewer species. The extinction rate should be about the same, but the immigration rate would be lower. The target size, a bigger patch can potentially affect more species and have more species hit the target versus a smaller island. These should be drawn as equivalent distance. Then that's going to affect fewer species would hit the target, more might fly by or miss or something like that. And then there's differential extinction. On a bigger island, it could potentially support more species through more different habitats or just more space for them. On a smaller island, you might have more of the species go extinct. So this basically functions in this way, that on a small island, you would tend to have lower species because the extinction rate is going to be higher and the immigration rate should be lower. So the intersection of those two curves shown on the left triangle. In contrast, a larger island should have higher immigration. It's a bigger target and lower extinction rate, and so it should equilibrate at a higher number of species located on that particular island. Thus, we can use these concepts to then design habitats for species or design reserves. You might pause the video or work with a partner and talk about the examples on the left. Why are these better designs and why are the ones on the right worse designs? So go ahead and pause the video if you want to do that. Ultimately, the reasons for the left-hand side tie back to this island biogeography theory and reasons why that's the case. A bigger island is better. Having one large one is thought to be better than several small ones. So a single large reserve is better at protecting biodiversity because each of the small reserves can only protect a few species. If they're close together, then that's better for getting them to migrate from one metapopulation to the other versus if they're further away. The ones that are in a straight line, it's easy for each one to then migrate to another, whereas the other, if you look at any one of the circles in green, it could migrate to the other three. And then if they're connected, that then provides even better because there's an unimpeded corridor that they can move through. For the bottom one, the one on the right is worse because there's more surface area. And a lot of times you can have outside factors impacting the reserve if you have a more convoluted or ovoid shape instead of a circular design. These sort of things have been put in action in practice in different places. So I want to give you some habitats in Belize to kind of illustrate this. The dark green areas are basically core areas that have jaguar populations, and these are really large habitats. The state of Belize is about the size of Vermont or New Hampshire. And if you go by car from Belize City all the way to the western part of the country, you can get there in about 2.5 hours. And then if you're going from the north all the way to the south, you wouldn't quite get all the way to the south because the roads don't go that far, but you could probably do it in about 6 hours. So just to put in perspective, and these are not great roads, but there are 4 main highways that extend through Belize. The Central Belize corridor then provides an interconnection between some of these, between the one in Guatemala and northwestern Belize and the central core, and then hooking into the ones in the Maya Mountains. The southern Belize corridor then connects the Maya Mountains and the Chiquiboul Reserve down with additional ones that are down in Guatemala and Honduras. So this then allows jaguars that are there to move from one habitat to another. Looking at the whole jaguar population throughout Central and South America, you can see there's this patchwork of core areas and then the interconnected corridors, both corridors that currently exist, which are in yellow, and then ones that have been kind of critically indicated as corridors of concern, which are in red, and they connect like highly isolated populations, or they have a high amount of urbanization within these areas. So really the genetics of the jaguar is such that it's all one species. It's not several different species in different parts of the system like they originally thought it might be, and that's due to the presence of these corridors allowing for interbreeding. If we look at an area, this is the Santa Monica Mountains just west of Los Angeles. Currently, there are some fires going on in Pacific Palisades. That would be in between the protected areas and kind of east of Malibu, indicated on this slide. So these are a patchwork of areas of protection: National Park, California Department of Parks and Recreation, both of those in green, Mountain Recreation and Conservation Authority, Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, LA County Parks, Ventura County Parks, local open space agencies around Thousand Oaks. So I used to live in Thousand Oaks and went to undergrad there, and the patch that's to the upper left of the T in Thousand Oaks, that's Wildwood Sanctuary, and it basically protects this large area of isolated habitat. I wouldn't say it's wilderness, but it's an isolated habitat patch, and then it interconnects it with some of the ridge lines where there's unique biodiversity in those areas. So, but that was a local agency saying we're going to keep this set aside as parks. City parks can be agencies to protect it. If you look on the right-hand side above Angeles, in Los Angeles, that's Griffith Park. It's a really large area that includes the Griffith Observatory, a large open space protection. I believe the Hollywood sign is near there or just to the west of there, that sort of thing. But all sorts of different agencies protecting different patches. But you can also see that they have worked, except for the ones in Thousand Oaks, they have worked to kind of buy land in order to connect these little patches of habitat between one area and the other. And so this has allowed things like pumas, mountain lions, are able to move between one habitat and another, even in an urbanized area like Los Angeles. In ocean systems, there are different types of habitats located in different locations, and many of these are set aside as MPAs or marine protected areas. As of 2017, these covered about 6% of the ocean. The goal is to then expand this and make it a larger proportion of protected area. And the idea is that then species protected in one area could then their offspring could then move to other adjacent MPAs as long as there was suitable habitat within this area. And then if they move to non-protected areas, they could be fished for if they're fish or shellfish or something like that. So this is a goal that protects both the species themselves as well as the utilitarian values of these species outside of the protected areas. I've had a chance to work with the Elizabeth River Project on a series of restorations and serve on their board. And these are some examples of the types of things that they'll do. Along an area of shoreline where the marsh is susceptible to erosion, they might put in place these oyster castles, which are a series of interlocking blocks. They kind of look like this. So they're concrete blocks, and they interconnect. You can place them so they interconnect with each other, and it enhances stability, and then that helps to protect the shoreline. Sometimes beyond this area, they'll add in sand in order to help account for sea level rise and things like that, and then they'll plant marsh grasses behind it. So you can see in the shot on the left-hand side, there's a whole row of the oyster castles, and then later they came back and added the marsh grasses behind that. In the right-hand picture, this shows brand new castles placed that day, and then on the left-hand side of the picture to the right, these are castles that have been placed 4 years earlier in more susceptible areas of this particular private property. And you can see it's entirely coated with oysters and rib mussels and barnacles and stuff like that, indicating that these very quickly become functional habitat. And the oysters and the mussels are basically filtering the water, providing some water quality benefits for that area. So it's habitat for species, it's protection for the landowner to keep their shoreline from eroding, and it's also helping to clean up the water quality of these particular areas. Other species that rely on marsh grass can benefit from marsh grass planting. So on the left-hand side, this adds to the salt marsh cordgrass, which is at low habitat, adds it, and then partway up here we've transitioned to a species called Spartina patens, salt meadow hay, which is seen there. In this diagram here, you can see the cordgrass on the left, plugs of cordgrass shown here in these little trays. And then in the back corner here, we planted one called black needle rush, juncus, and it can deal with shady habitats. So people coming in and restoring the area, it's not a one-size-fits-all plan. You have to design each plan for each property based on what are the physical variables in that area. How high is this above sea level? How much tidal immersion is there going to be? How much sunlight is it going to get? And then you plant according to that. You remove invasive species before you do that. This area had been knocked out by Phragmites australis. They came in and they trimmed it back down and eliminated it with herbicides in that area, which are appropriate for something like this where it's really hard to get an invasive species out otherwise. And then they come back and plant native grasses. And generally when these happen, within a year, the native species take over and it's almost entirely native populations. So this is a good example on the right picture here. This is my oceanography class planting some marsh plants, Spartina alterniflora, which is the salt marsh cordgrass, at the Poplar Hall neighborhood of Norfolk. So it's a great way to involve the community. It's a great way to protect that area. Now, is this a species approach or is this an ecosystem approach? I would say it's kind of a little bit in between. You're targeting a key habitat, you're working to remove exotic species, you're working to restore native populations. That's an ecosystem approach, but it's also targeting critical individual species. There's no Endangered Species Act with this, but marshes have certain protection, and it kind of targets what's the function that's needed. So it's probably more on the ecosystem side than on the species side. What about coral reef restorations? A lot of our coral reefs are threatened by climate change, by bleaching diseases, and boat damage and things like that. But scientists realize that a really cool thing that you can do with them is if you fragment corals into these smaller chunks, you can then glue them onto a surface or hang them from this spacer that you see there, and then they actually grow pretty quickly and can reach a size where they can be restored into the natural habitat by gluing them to, using underwater marine adhesive, gluing them to a coral reef. So here's some other examples of this. The left-hand side, this is at the Mote Marine Laboratory and Aquarium. They're starting with these tiny little pieces of coral, culturing them up. Then they glue them onto a rack out on the reef. By having it lifted up, it gets more wave action and more plankton over it. So you can then grow large quantities of them, and then ultimately they'll grow over and in and around this particular area, and it just becomes part of the reef. Again, what sort of approach is this? Is this an ecosystem approach, or is this a species by species approach? Well, the coral protection is a species approach. It's not on the Endangered Species Act, but certain corals could be. But then this provides a way to restore the ecosystem. So a lot of restoration efforts are really kind of a combination of species and ecosystem approach. But I want you to be thinking about each and the value of these two approaches. Thanks.